Well, alright, my parts are at the machine shop. I wasn't able to source out a couple of good heads, so I went ahead and bought a brand new set of heads from Summit Racing. It's their Summit heads, their Vortec style head, and it's made by Dart. They should be pretty good heads. But I'm waiting for my pistons to come in, which unfortunately is not going to be until Thursday. I'm sending the block out to be decked and bored, but they need the pistons because they're going to actually machine each hole to the actual piston itself, because the pistons may have a little bit of deviation in them, so they're going to be set right on the money in terms of tolerance. So I'm waiting for that to happen. Once I get the pistons in and get them over there, I'll probably get it back the next day. They'll bore it out, press the pistons onto the rods, be done. But in the meantime, I've been cleaning up peripherals, the tins, things of that nature. All the nuts and bolts have been put through the ultrasonic cleaner, so they're all super clean and ready to go. This is the bracket that holds down the lifter plates. I wasn't able to put the whole thing in the ultrasonic cleaner, just about half and half, and then had to put it in different positions. I had to clean the middle section pretty much by hand, but it's better than doing it all by hand. So anything I can fit in that ultrasonic cleaner is great. If you guys haven't seen the video on that, check it out. It's kind of small. I already want a bigger one, but this is the pickup for the front of the crank. I thought this thing was aluminum oxide. It was black when I put it in there. This is the way it came out. Here's another example of something that's been cleaned in the ultrasonic cleaner. This as well had to be put in there in certain positions and run it on many cycles. This is where the oil filter spins on and the oil cooler lines run off right here. I went ahead and took the fittings and the plugs out and resealed those just to make sure I'm not going to have any leaks. But this thing is super clean in and out, and no scrubbing, no nothing. That cleaner, ultrasonic cleaner, is awesome. But anyway, I was working on the intake here, pulling off the thermostat housing, the thermostat, pulling off the EGR valve, taking the spider injector out. This is a spider injector. It's called that because it looks like a spider, obviously. But it's just mounted in this clip, and this clip is loose. That's not a problem. But you got to be very careful with these because these lines are pretty brittle and you can break them, and these things are pretty expensive from what I understand. So you have to squeeze these clips on here and carefully get them out of these holes where the poppets are installed, and then push the spiders together, the legs, and then work on this clamp. There's some clips that hold it in. You have to peel one side and just slowly work it out, and then you can get it out of there. I will clean this up. More than likely I will take these nuts off the bottom, pull these out, spray some brake clean in there, blow them out, something, but it will all be getting cleaned up as well. Of course, cleaning the manifold, this is going to be a fun task. I think I'm going to soak it in some purple power or whatnot, and I'm actually going to break out my power washer outside and try to get the bulk of this off. And I'll do what I can't do by hand, but since it's a brand new motor, all this gunk and crud that could get sucked down in it, I don't want it there. So everything is getting super clean like it's brand new. So that's where I'm at. Alright, we got the lower intake manifold all cleaned up. That took probably 2 to 3 hours. What I used was this Berryman B12 Chem Tool carburetor choke and throttle body cleaner. This is great stuff for dissolving things, and it does not have a bad interaction with aluminum. It's just fine and safe to use. But hopefully you can see how clean all these intake port runners are all the way through. They're spotless. I still had to scrub with a toothbrush, you know, and get down in there and get in the nooks and crannies, but it's easy work. It just took a little bit of time. The reason that this is so nasty up in here, they get nasty, is it has an EGR valve that sits right here, and that's exhaust gas recirculation. So it basically takes spent gas from the exhaust, puts it back in through this pipe, and it refeeds it through the cylinders to burn it again. So it's supposed to make the emissions run a little bit better, but they sure make things nasty on the inside of an engine. So this is all cleaned up, ready to go. Well, alright guys, I was cleaning all my parts and peripherals and ran into a problem. I got to the spider injector and I was getting ready to clean it up. First thing I noticed was, hopefully you can see how these are shaped on the end and then their length. I had one of them that was just melted off. It's just burned off on the end. Hopefully you can see that. Now I had gone through the lower manifold and replaced the intake gaskets on this, as well as gone into the upper manifold, removed the spider and cleaned it about 2 years ago. Now you have to keep in mind that this truck has probably only been used about 500 to 1,000 miles in that time. So why this happened, I'm not real sure. But here's one thing I found interesting. The cylinder that I had the bent exhaust valve on happened to be number 5 on the exhaust side. This came from the number 5 injector. Right there. Now these are in the manifold on the intake side, but this evidently got so hot at some point that it just melted this plastic off, and it was not that way when I did the rebuild 2 years ago, or I would have addressed it. So what I ended up doing, in lieu of spending $300 on an aftermarket spider injector to replace this, because I spent tons of money so far, I'll tabulate it out at the end of the video, is ordered some of these off eBay. And would you believe I'm paying $28 for 8 of these pieces of plastic? But it's going to save me money because I find nothing wrong with all the injectors. Now I went ahead and pulled the one out of the number 5 hole, and I tested it even prior to that, simply with just a 9-volt battery. I'm going to try to let you hear it clicking, but here we go. I don't know if you hear that clicking noise, but that indicates that it is actuating properly. And I did pull the hose off of that and shot some compressed air in this end and watched the poppet move. And it is moving. It is not hung up. So between replacing the ends, I'm also going to put an O-ring seal kit in here, which is $14.69. When I pulled the plate off that holds the injectors in, I noticed some fresh fuel in here, and it shouldn't be. So it appears that a couple of these O-rings are leaking just a bit. So all these injectors are going to come out. I'm going to reseal those. I will clean and check all the poppet valves and make sure that they're okay, as well as put a whole brand new set of ends on them, and hopefully salvage myself and not have to lay out the $300. Now this thing's gone 200,000 miles. A lot of people don't like these. I don't really know why, but it's run that long, so hopefully I can get it again. So it'll be totally dismantled, cleaned, O-ringed, sealed, new ends on, everything checked out, dialed in, then it will go. Well, alright, the spider injector assembly has been 100% dismantled, cleaned, inspected, new seals, this, that, and the other. It looks brand new if you ask me. You have to be very careful getting these injectors out of here. After you remove this plate, there's a small hole in between these two pins. You have to press on that to push them out. But these O-rings are really seated in over time. So what I ended up doing was digging the little plastic ring out from the bottom, digging the O-ring out from the bottom, and that took a little bit away from it so I could just press them out of there. Everything worked out okay for me. The kit, which was about $15, did not come with the O-rings in this area for the fuel pressure regulator. So those have been reused. There's a larger one here on this end, and then there's a small one and another small one down on here. There was no issue with that, but buyer beware. If you're buying the rebuild kit, it may not be 100%. So at this point, I'm just waiting for the new ends to come in to put on. Those should be here on Saturday, and then this will be ready to go back into service. I found no issue with it whatsoever, aside from just simply needing a rebuild, so it should last a long time at this stage. Alright, well here's my crude oil cooler cleaning contraption. I've got a 12-volt Holley fuel pump down here I borrowed from my dad, and it's being powered by a 12-volt power supply. I'm flushing the system in reverse, so I'm going in the out and it's coming back in. I've got some purple power in that pan right there. It's being pumped up through the oil cooler, which is part of the radiator, and then going back through 2 paint strainers so I can see if there was any swarf in it or anything like that. You know, typically you might want to change that oil cooler out, but it's part of the radiator, and that's another, you know, 150, 160 bucks, you know, and where do you stop? So I'm going to flush it with purple power for a while. I may chase it with some new. I'll switch over to kerosene and run it for a while until it's super clean, and then it will be followed by super hot water and then dried out with compressed air. Alright, well I got the block, the crank, and the pistons back from the machine shop a few days ago. I've been cleaning all the other parts, so I'm cleaning up the block now so I can paint it. I'm going to paint it first, then do the head separately, and then put it together. And the reason for that is I can't get it far enough away from my house to paint it whole, so it's going to be going out in pieces, and then I'll put it together, wheel it out the front, and stick it back in the truck. I had it bored out 30 thousandths over. I had it decked. It came out of the hot tank and it was still kind of scaly. It had paint that was still on it, so I've been stripping it to prepare the block for the paint job. Not fun, but not hard. It's coated in WD-40 right now, just so it doesn't flash rust. I'll wipe it down with some brake cleaner, some lacquer thinner, right before I paint it. So I'm at the stage now where I need to remove a little bit of the paint that's still holding on, mask it off and shoot it, and then I'm going to start putting it back together. Alright, well I'd mentioned earlier in the video, I believe, that instead of using the drive-in galley oil plugs right here that are staked so they can't come out, that I was going to tap these holes out for pipe thread plugs. So I have done that. I intended to do this before it went to the machine shop, but I just simply ran out of time, so I did it right now. Instead of just using a cutting oil on this, it's just a trick you might entertain. I stuck the tap down in grease and got it greasy, so as I was cutting my threads, the chips were actually embedding themselves in the grease, so there was very little in there that I needed to clean out post threading things. To clean anything out, I had simply took my rifle kit and I ran from the back side to the front and pushed any of those chips out. So it is super clean. And one thing to note on these, especially in this one right here, there is a hole just shortly in there that oils this front cam bearing, and in turn goes down and oils the front crank journal on the main. So you want to make sure that you don't go too deep with your plug, or you can block off that oil passage and starve the motor of what it wants. So these are looking good right now. And there's another thing to note. They'll go in a little bit deeper than what they are now. That's just hand tight. But you want to make sure when you get your cam retainer on, and then of course the timing gear that runs on the cam, that you don't interfere with these as well. So everything's looking good in my case. These will be installed with a high temp thread sealant, and that will ensure that no oil gets past them, and I will just get the oil where I need it. Now this is usually a racing type application or something like that, where you're using like a high pressure, maybe a high volume oil pump, and you don't want to run the risk of blowing those oil galley plugs out the front and losing your oil pressure. This is just something I elected to do. It makes me feel better, and it only took me about 15-20 minutes to do it. Alright, well, I went ahead and painted the back of the block and drove in my core plugs. as well as the cam plug. I also used some high temp thread sealant on these 3 plugs and installed those. This way I can get it back on the stand and paint the rest of it. So this will now be masked off. Well, alright, the block's been painted. Got it back on the stand in here. Turn it up so you can see. I just went with the basic semi-gloss black. Looks pretty good. What I'm doing right now is chasing the threads for the head bolts, and all the bolts for that matter in the block. And I'm using a thread chaser. This is not a tap. This might be called a thread restorer. But I'm just simply going into every single head bolt hole, and I'm using a speed wrench and just running them in and knocking any scale or anything that off that might be on there. Plain and simple, that's what I'm doing here. That will ensure when I put the new head bolts in and torque them down that there's nothing interfering with that torque. If there's a bunch of scale or garbage in there, you may not get an accurate reading. Post doing this, the first thing I'm going to do is fit the cam. Even though a camshaft was fit at the machine shop, I was actually there when he did it, I've got a new cam, so I want to make sure the cam fits in there properly, because if there is a problem, I want to catch it right now before I get the whole motor put together with a crankshaft and everything else in it. So that's just where I'm starting, is to fit the cam. Well, alright, I got my new camshaft out and cleaned it up from the packing residue. Shot it down, hot water, blew it off, and then put a light coating of WD-40 on it. I'm getting ready to install it, and I actually found some camshaft and lube pre-lube, camshaft and lifter pre-lube that I've got 20 something years. So I've got the motor upside down. I'm going to go ahead and manually coat the cam bearings with my finger. Now this is a roller lifter, so this lubricating the lobes is probably not even really required, especially since I'm going to run the oil pump primer on it first. The reason I'm doing it this way is if you just lubricate the lobes or the journals on the cam, it's going to push a lot of it out. And in my opinion, this really isn't even required. It's just something I'm doing since I had it. All right. Excuse me. So we'll flip it over and install the cam. This is kind of a reverse of what I had done when I was taking it out. Just slowly coming in here. And just helping underneath the cylinders here to guide it in. Moving down into the next one. Moving into the next hole. And then finally the last hole. Having a little bit of an issue finding that one. There it goes. Alright, well the cam is installed and I can turn it, no problem. And that's why I started right here, because if there was an issue on a misalignment with these cam bearings or anything, or maybe they were too big or too small, I want to find that out first. So that looks good right there. So I'm ready to put on the retainer on the front and just go ahead and lock this cam in place. Alright, well I've installed the cam retaining plate on the front, put a little bit of lube behind it. These two bolts have been torqued down to 18 foot-pounds. Alright, well I'm going to put some lube on these cam lobes. This is a roller system, roller cam and lifters, so this really isn't required, but I'm going to put some on it anyway. Typically this would be done outside the block and you would just have a goopy mess that you were trying to put in there. I like doing it this way. Put the cam in first, lubricate the journals, get it in there, flip the block upside down, and then you can access it right here, and I'm still clean. So I'll do that very thing. I'm just going to put some on it, there and there. And just run my finger around each one while turning the cam. Now this stuff is really only designed to be there, in my opinion, for the initial startup. So I'm completely satisfied with the fit of the cam at this stage. So now I think I'm going to drive in the core plugs. A lot of people call them freeze plugs. They're really not freeze plugs, they're core plugs. They're just plugs from the casting, and they've been driven in to simply fill the hole from the casting process. Whether or not they will pop out if the block gets cold enough to freeze, I don't know. Well, alright, I'm installing the core plugs now. You can see I've got a little bit of tape around here and cut it out. The reason for that is I'm using this Indian head gasket shellac compound. This is really nasty stuff. You can run these plugs dry, but I'm not taking the risk of anything leaking. So I'm going to put it in with this shellac compound. I've made myself a driver to install these and set them at their proper depth on my lathe. So in essence what I'm going to do here is take some of the shellac and just put a nice light coating in this hole. Excuse me. And I'll also just put a thin layer around here. There we go. And we're getting ready to install the plug. And this is going to get loud, but here we go. I should just have to drive this till it stops. And there we go. Take a little bit of lacquer thinner and clean up the mess. And I'll do the rest the exact same way. Well, alright, all the core plugs have been installed. I'm now installing these 3 plugs in the front, which I had tapped. I'm using this Permatex high temp sealant, and I'm starting at about a thread back, and I'm going around at about 3/4 the way. That's all you need right there. So I'll tighten this up and do the other 2. And this step will be complete. Alright, well, these 3 plugs have been sealed and installed. I put the cam gear on just to make sure that nothing was going to interfere here. And everything looks really good right now. Well, alright, I've just installed the forgotten oil plug, which is in this hole right here. There's a passage that runs this way and one that runs that way, and the plug sits in between those 2. I had mentioned earlier in the video that if this is not put in, you may not have oil pressure. I don't believe that's actually true. You will have oil pressure, but what you won't have is filtration. One of these passages runs off to the oil filter itself, and the other one, I believe, is the one that escapes it. So make sure you get that in there. I set mine to a depth of just shy of 1.5 inches, which is what I measured before I knocked it out. So everything is looking good right now. Alright, I'm still installing plugs. Put this one in right here. And now we'll be installing this plug right here. And there we go. And yet another plug. I think I've about got the block tight in terms of plugs, caps, this, that, and the other. And there we go. Alright, well, this is the passenger side. I'm installing the knock sensor right now.
And there we have it.
Alright, well I'm going to install the gear on the front of this. I put in my Woodruff keys. I'm doing this now because I don't want to do it with it in the block, because as you're beating this on you'll be hammering on your thrust bearing. So I'm just using a 36mm socket. And that's it. Now obviously I put the dot to the outside, and I do have it sitting on a block of wood. Now it's ready to go in. Alright, well, I'm getting ready to install the crankshaft. I've got all the new bearings inserted here. You just need to make sure that the ones with the holes, they're the uppers, and there's an oiling passage. The ones that go in the caps do not have that. So assembly lube could be used here. I'm just going to use straight oil. So I'll just put a little on here. Work it around just a little bit to coat this surface. I'm going to be pre-priming the motor anyway before it's installed, so this is the way I always do it, or the way I've always done it. So now I need to set the crank in very carefully. And there it is. I'll lubricate the caps. I'll get the bolts lubricated on the threads as well as up underneath the hat, and then they'll be torqued down to spec. Now the caps are numbered, at least on my motor, 1 to 4. So the arrow points towards the front of the block. This would be number 1, 2, 3, 4. 5, the thrust bearing cap is not marked, but it can only go in one direction anyway.